Hi, and welcome to the 19th Hole Golf Show. I'm Ryan Ballengee. It's great to have you here with us for our first show of 2026 and one of the first video versions we've ever done of the show. Catch the video version on my YouTube channel at Ryan Ballengee Golf, or, of course, the traditional way on podcast feed on the service of your choice. In today's episode, we're going to talk about public golf in Washington, D.C., and the Trump administration's move before the end of the year to terminate a 50-year lease of a not-for-profit called the National Links Trust that had been operating the three DC public golf facilities pretty successfully for the last 5 years. So we're going to get into what happened, perhaps why it happened, although there are perfectly clear explanations why, but you could have some inferences and reasons. And then what happens kind of in the meantime, or what could happen next. So for those of you who aren't in tune with local public golf scenes, and I would expect that to be most people, that the DC public golf scene is unique, right? Washington, D.C. is a city in a federal republic. It's not a state. It's grounds for the public golf courses. There are three of them. They are run by the National Park Service. And there really is no private golf to speak of significance within the confines of D.C. In the D.C. area, you have a lot of great private clubs. You've got Congressional and Chevy Chase in Columbia and Army, Navy, and Washington Golf and Country, all outside of the boundaries of Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. And you've got these three public golf facilities that the National Park Service has owned and run forever on behalf of the residents of D.C. and the American people. And in October 2020, so toward the tail end of the first Trump administration, a not-for-profit called the National Links Trust that was formed specifically around this purpose of taking over and managing and operating and then restoring and renovating the three DC public golf facilities. They finally secured a 50-year lease with the National Park Service. And that agreement was celebrated throughout golf. And the big reason for that was because it was an opportunity for the National Links Trust to really renovate, restore, and have a vision for the future and future generations of DC public golf. So let's start at the beginning. What are the three DC public golf facilities and what are their individual significances to golf and to DC golf? So as it turns out, DC golf has a wealth of incredible golf and golf history to it in its three public facilities. The first one I'm going to mention is Langston Golf Course, which is, if you know the plot of DC, right, it's into four quadrants by direction. So you've got northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. Langston is a predominantly African-American club. It's kind of historic around African-American golf. It has its own kind of internal clubs, even though it's a public facility. There's a men's club, there's a women's club. They're both historic and really awesome. And this facility sits near what is ultimately going to be replaced by the new Washington Commander Stadium, where RFK Stadium, well, the remnants of it, sit. And once that's removed, that'll be the site for the new Commander Stadium. So it's within earshot. You can see it from the golf course, right? That facility is the one that sees a lot of volume, but has probably historically gotten the least amount of plaudits for what it is and what it means to the community. It sits on a plot of land near the Anacostia that is kind of divided. It's an 18-hole golf course, but there's kind of a dividing point with some marshland that kind of forces the routing around that to a degree. So you have that property. Then you have the kind of showcase property. You have East Potomac Golf Club, East Potomac Golf Links Golf Course. Just call it East Potomac. Some people call it Haynes Point because that's where this sits. So again, to kind of put you in the perspective of where you are in DC, you are right in the mix of the monuments, right? You can get off basically at the National Mall and you can walk 6 or 7 minutes and you would find yourself right on the grounds of East Potomac. East Potomac has multiple courses. So it has the blue course, which, as you can kind of see, fronts the water. It's beautiful, great land, about 7 holes route back into playing toward the Washington Monument. So you're playing a bunch of holes toward the Washington Monument, which is the tallest building in Washington, D.C. by law. It's really beautiful to see. And that blue course where you get those vistas was originally built by Walter Travis in the 1920s, and it was a reversible golf course. It was historic because it was reversible. And ultimately, that faded away over time and just kind of became a single routing, one-way, 18-hole golf course. There are two other golf courses at East Potomac, too. There's the white course and the red course. Those are short 9-hole courses. And then also there's a driving range, which is exceptionally popular. And then there's the mini golf facility. It's the only miniature golf course in Washington, D.C., sits at East Potomac. So that's that facility. Then fast forward through those, and you also have Rock Creek Park. So Rock Creek Park was a William Flynn design. So William Flynn, think Shinnecock Hills. That guy did Rock Creek Park, which is pretty incredible. 18-hole golf course. It's its own park. That's a little bit more as you enter into Washington, D.C. through Chevy Chase from Maryland, right off of 16th Street. It's, again, part of a bigger Rock Creek Park facility, but the William Flynn design is the one that probably had the most overgrowth and problematic issues of just maintenance, because it had really been left not quite to fallow, but you could argue that over the years. A lot of tree growth, a lot of trees that weren't pruned, just kind of blocking play, creating erosion problems at different points of the property. That one probably gets talked about the least, or tied for the least with Langston, I suppose. But that golf course is really important to the history of DC public golf. So you had these facilities. National Links Trust signs a 50-year lease, right? And that 50-year lease required them to do certain things. And among those, they had to operate and manage the golf courses day to day with a certain amount of rent to be paid back to the National Park Service every month. That lease, which we have a copy of and we'll show you more about later, requires them to pay 16% of the gross revenue from operation of the golf courses. And that includes pretty much everything, anything that can make money from their operations. That 16% has to come from that. And that's to be paid to the National Park Service after each month. And then part of the agreement, they are required per schedule in the document, call it Exhibit D. We're supposed to make initial improvements to each of the three facilities on more or less a kind of vague timeline over the course of about a decade, all told. But they were supposed to go kind of one by one. Rock Creek Park would be first in 2022 as part of the loose timeline. Langston would be next in 2024. And then finally, the biggest of the facilities, East Potomac, would be in 2027. And the National Links Trust would be required to raise the revenue, to do those projects, make those capital improvements, and really bring up the level of DC public golf. And again, they were first charged with doing Rock Creek Park. What they had managed to do, somewhat miraculously, I think, is to get some of the best modern golf architects to agree to waive their fees and do this work pro bono. So Gil Hansen, his design firm, so Jim Wagner, they agreed to do Rock Creek Park. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Then over at Langston, Bo Welling, who has worked with Tiger Woods' design firm and done a lot of the architecture with their team, but also is a great architect on his own. He agreed to do the Langston project, which is really just that 18-hole golf course. There's not additional stuff around it. And then East Potomac Golf Links, that was going to be by Tom Doak. Doak was going to restore the reversible routing from Travis on the blue course, and then reimagine the white and the red courses. One was going to be a 9-hole executive course of par 3s and par 4s, and then one was going to be a short course, basically just short par 3s. And then the mini golf course, that has already been restored, and that was one of the early projects from the National Links Trust. So they wanted to have that restored so people could come and play. And again, that's easy recurring money. Get that up to snuff. It's something you don't really have to put a lot of money into operating day to day. And so they could have that money coming in. They also pursued similar kind of capital heavy, but big return, big quick return investment projects in the driving ranges at Langston and East Potomac. So they put top tracer technology at both of those driving ranges. As I mentioned before, the East Potomac range does a lot of business. Langston does pretty well too. They regrass the entire Langston range. I saw it for myself when I played a National Links Trust fundraising event there in 2024. The range looked really, really good. And even for a random weekday when I was playing in the event, there were plenty of people in the range. It was a good looking range. Callaway golf balls, I assume, provided a lower cost, if not no cost, from Callaway Golf. Again, those kinds of investments were good at the beginning because those improvements are something that don't require as much capital, but can get a quick return on that investment. Get people going to the range, hitting balls, hitting buckets. That's relatively easy money to not only pay back your investment, but then also put that additional money back into your other projects. Meanwhile, they're still continuing to fundraise across all of these other projects. They have a really nice online golf shop. They sell hoodies and other merch and polos and head covers and bags and bag tags. And they make some really awesome DC themed merch. And so they were raising some money that way as well. But ultimately, it really came down to a donor class of people who were willing to stroke bigger checks to fund these capital intensive projects that they were contractually obligated to start over again, kind of 5-year period, 5-ish year period, 2 years into 2027, but we're not contractually required to do it exactly on these times and exactly on this schedule. It was kind of meant to be a guideline with some room for forgiveness. So over that period, the National Links Trust has done a great job. They've doubled the number of rounds that have been played at the 3 facilities since they took over in October 2020, noting that golf has obviously seen a boom in that period since they took over, but also there was still quite a bit of apprehension from a number of people, not everybody, but certainly from a number of people, about playing golf and being outdoors as the COVID-19 pandemic started to kind of come off from its peak and then begin to wane. Nevertheless, a nice explosion of golf. And people were happy almost universally across DC in terms of patrons to those facilities about the improvements made. Everyone involved knew this was going to be a long project. It wasn't going to be something that happened overnight, and that there was a lot of triage work, a lot of basic deferred maintenance that had to be done first at all 3 facilities to get them to a level where the conditions were better and that would warrant more rounds. So things like improving drainage, getting rid of invasive species of grass, of other vegetation, killing that vegetation, expanding green sizes to kind of recapture what had been lost over the years, particularly at East Potomac and at Langston. Not so much at Rock Creek, because that was going to be, that was always intended to be the biggest project of the 2 lesser known facilities, right? The intent behind Rock Creek was to take the 18-hole course, the William Flynn design that was there, retain the 9 best holes that they could, take the other 9 holes, remove those, create a short course in the vein of Flynn architecture with the help of Gil Hanse and Jim Wagner, then have a very nice practice facility, incredibly large putting space, beautiful driving range facility. That was supposed to be the future of this facility for Rock Creek Park. So that was their big challenge. That was their kind of first ask was, imagine this project, get the funding for it, get the approvals for it through the National Capital Parks Commission, as well as Capital Planning Commission, as well as the National Park Service. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved in doing anything in DC. That's just the kind of reality of effectively working in a historic place all the time, right? And the community, while the golf community was absolutely behind the ideas for the changes to Rock Creek, it wasn't that simple of a process. So for the National Links Trust, they really had to work hard to get the money raised to even go through the legal process of getting approval. It took multiple years, lots of public hearings, lots of public comment, lots of demonstrations, lots of slides, lots of architectural drawings, all kinds of stuff that cost about $3.5 million just to get that approved. Just to get that to a yes. And then, amidst all this process, the folks at National Link Trust were trying to clear out trees so that the course could be more playable day to day, The grass could be in better condition. It could just work better. That was a 7-figure outlay unto itself. So now they're in for about $4.5 million into Rock Creek Park before they even really have done what they actually want to do to the place. That approval had been achieved last year, well, now in 2024, and the work had started there. Meanwhile, they were still trying to raise money for Langston, and then ultimately East Potomac was going to be the biggest one of all, right? We don't know the final price tag of what the East Potomac work was going to look like, but just kind of knowing modern architecture, modern costs, proper drainage, all of that stuff, you're probably looking in the area of $25 to $30 million to do the 18-hole course, reversible blue course, and a red and white reimagined properly. So that was a lot of money. So they were trying to kind of check these things off one at a time so that the improvements would ultimately bring in more money to fund the next thing, right? So they had shovels in the ground. They were working on Rock Creek Park. And then over the summer, the golf courses caught the attention of the Trump administration. So on August 1st, the Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, who is a vastly wealthy man, and the Solicitor General, they kind of got together and went to President Trump and said they would like to have a reimagined East Potomac Golf Club. They would want it to be called Washington National, and that they want that 18-hole golf course to be able to host championship events, including the PGA Tour. Trump, being a guy whose Trump organization, Trump Golf Wing of that, owns and operates 17 private clubs or resorts around the world, and many of those were acquired for relatively cheap cents on the dollar prices for a lot of distressed properties, and was very skilled and adept at purchasing those and creating them into a network. He kind of jumped at the idea and started kind of getting the wheels in motion for what has ultimately happened here. Then in October, at the end of October, the Trump administration, through the Department of the Interior, reached out with a letter to the National Links Trust, effectively accusing them of being in default of their lease. It turned out to be a 2-sentence letter, and it doesn't really explain a whole lot other than to say that the Trump administration believed the National Links Trust was not abiding by what it agreed to do in the lease, and asked for some kind of remedy or resolution to the issue, but it wasn't clear what exactly they were looking for. Then, not too long after that, or in that kind of contemporaneous time frame, the White House, the Trump administration, demolished the East Wing of the White House. And in doing so, they had a ton of rubble on White House property. They moved that rubble, at least a significant chunk of it, over to East Potomac and told the National Links Trust that they would be in violation of their lease agreement if they refused to accept it on property. So that rubble now currently sits fenced around over at East Potomac Golf Club. National Links Trust really couldn't do anything about that, right? So the next step from there was an acknowledgement, obviously, that the Trump administration was trying to come up with a way to get itself out of this lease, this 50-year lease, and that they had to find some kind of cause to do that, right? And ultimately, they, at the same time, went to Tom Fazio, an architect whose best work has really been known in the 80s and 90s. But his firm has done some really nice restoration work, including at Fox Chapel, just outside of, just the club right opposite of Oakmont in the Pittsburgh area. Did a great job with the Seth Rainer work there. But Fazio answered the call, visited the White House, and seems to have presented some kind of plan for what he would want to reimagine East Potomac Golf Links Blue Course as, and seemingly not as an 18-hole reversible course that pays homage, if not full restoration, to what Travis did in the 20s. So altogether, you've got all of these storm clouds brewing around the National Links Trust and their management of the DC courses. And just before the end of the year, National Links Trust gets the letter, says, we're terminating your lease from the Trump administration. Here are the things that you failed to do. And those three things are kind of 3 bullet points that we'll go over here uh, in the next few minutes. So the first bullet point is the accusation the National Links Trust did not do enough improvement relative to the promises that were made in the lease that was signed in 2020. That's the first point. Second point is that the accusation they are behind in rent to the National Park Service to the tune of $8.8 million. We'll also come back to that point as well. And then finally, that National Links Trust didn't do enough to cure or remedy the accusations made in that October letter accusing the National Links Trust of being in default of their lease. We'll talk about that as well. So first, I think it helps to have some kind of understanding of what the expectations were from the lease itself. I mentioned we obtained a copy of that. You can get it. You can search around the internet. It's also available. I shared it out on my social media accounts. It's a publicly available document. It was anyway. I just made it easier to find it over at scribd.com, SCRIBD.com. And then we'll put a link in the show description as well so you can check it out. But the first kind of point about the lease, other than it's a 50-year lease, is trying to understand what the rent is due to the National Park Service. And that lease requires the National or Links Trust to pay 16% of gross receipts, so gross revenues, out to the federal government. So 16% right off the top, pretty much everything in their golf operations. That's green fees, that's lesson fees minus what goes to the actual person teaching them. That goes to driving range buckets, mini golf, cart fees, pro shop stuff, you name it. That was going to the federal government as part of that 16%, right? And that's reasonable. That's normal. That's the kind of thing that happens in golf club management when a manager like a Troon or formerly a Billy Casper Golf or an American Golf or Kemper Lesnick, take your pick. Whenever they manage a facility for someone else, they're kicking back to them a percentage, right? So 84% still went to National Links Trust. Now, obviously, there's overhead, there's employees to pay, there's course maintenance that's not considered capital improvements, just day-to-day stuff. There's building maintenance, all these different things that goes into it. So whatever the ultimate margin was that was going toward the next steps of this project, 16% right off the top was going to the federal government. Totally fair, completely normal. So we know that. But what's also important to know is that there's something called rent reconsideration as part of the agreement. This is a 50-year agreement, right? So the rent wasn't going to always stay the same, exactly the same forever. And so that was built into this agreement on purpose so that the federal government could say to National Links Trust at the 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, and 40-year marks, we need to change the lease terms. We need to change the rent terms based on current market conditions, what's happening, what the ground's worth, all of that different stuff. They could agree. The federal government could just say, hey, we're hiking the rent. Here's why. And that would be kind of the next stage of terms. The agreement would evolve over time based on a variety of factors. So that's included in this. And I want to point that out because, again, the lease started in October of 2020. So we have passed that 5-year mark. And the letter that came at the end of October comes at the end of that, just after that 5-year period, that 5-year anniversary of taking over. So this is something that could come into play in the Trump administration's ultimate arguments about why it revoked the lease. And then there's this important, really, really important crux of the argument, part of the terms, and it's rent offsets. And rent offsets are effectively built into this agreement as a way of incentivizing the National Links Trust to put money back into the properties. So for the dollars that were put into Rock Creek Park, Langston, and East Potomac to improve the facilities, either as part of that Exhibit D we talked about earlier, that initial improvement plan, or just kind of general projects to make the place better, those investments could offset due rent. So you could go put several $1 million into these golf courses, and that would offset the rent. There are some important caveats to that as well, as you'll notice in this graphic, that the rent offset couldn't be applied to the first $12,500 of rent in every month. So no matter what, if you got to $12,500 of rent, so 16% of that gross revenue, which they were going to hit, that had to be paid regardless. After that, you could apply those offsets. Further, if you had more offsets in a given year than rent you owed, it could be applied moving forward, which is an important thing to think about as well, because the rent may not have been $3.6 million in the years in which the National Links Trust got the Rock Creek Park project off the ground, but the money applied to that would then extend out over a longer period of time. So you get the benefit of an initial investment for a longer period, potentially speaking. These projects had to be approved by the National Park Service, and they can be reevaluated from time to time. Same thing with the approved projects that are outside of the scope of this Exhibit D. So those are the things to improve drainage or remove invasive species of vegetation, improving clubhouse things, driving ranges, all those different types of things, like basic stuff, basic maintenance, that bigger project, but not given simple maintenance, somewhere in between. So not a massive outlay, not just kind of sweeping up the place type stuff, somewhere in between those. So these are some really important caveats to this case, right? Because the National Links Trust says they've put $8.5 million of capital improvement into the three facilities over the course of those 5 years. About half of that money, a little short of half of that money, has gone to Rock Creek Park, which per the terms of the agreement makes sense. They've done that on a elongated timeline, right, for what they had initially had in the lease document, which is really the crux of what the Trump administration is saying here. You didn't start this exactly in 2022, therefore we're coming to get you. That's not really the language that's in Exhibit D. It has grace period. It has expectations that things could change or plans could change or that approvals could take time, all of those different things. There's a forgiveness period in there. But I think National Links Trust would admit to you that things haven't gone as quickly as they've painted that rosy picture in that initial document. But they also have language in there to give them an out to continue. They were still raising money for the Langston project for that tournament I participated in 2024. There's still intent to, or it still was intent to, of course, do all of that work, just needed to continue to raise that money. So that's kind of the one big part of it is, okay, you didn't do things on the timeline that you said. Well, they didn't commit to an exact timeline of it. So that's argument number one from National Links Trust. Argument number two is, hey, we've put in the $8.5 million of improvements. So if we've put those $8.5 million of improvements in, and you say we owe $8.8 million worth of rent that hasn't been paid, okay, well then now we're down to $300,000 if you subtract the $8.5 million from the $8.8 million. And I think the Trump administration, if you made me guess, would say that, oh, we would not count then the preparation work for the project. We only care about shovels in the ground type stuff, and you haven't done that, so therefore you owe us all of this money. That's not seemingly backed up by the National Park Service Exhibit D, as well as probably approvals to other work that was done at these facilities. And certainly Trump, as a developer, would absolutely count the preparation cost for a project into the total financing, into the total of the project. And that could be write-offs for his businesses and LLCs contained within. So that one doesn't hold up particularly well either. And then the last thing is that the accusation was the National Links Trust didn't do enough in response to the October letter to cure the vague issues stated before. And the vague issues were basically, you didn't do the work that you said you were going to do in the timeline you said you were going to do it. Well, the National Links Trust then decided to throw a 7-figure sum at trying to mobilize construction resources faster at Rock Creek Park to get things moving a little bit quicker. But it's the end of the year, November and December. Not a whole lot of golf course architecture gets done in this region in that time frame. So not exactly sure what throwing $1 million at that was going to do, or what the Trump administration could have reasonably expected to have been done in the intervening period from that letter to when the termination letter was sent. So where does that leave us? Well, National Links Trust is still operating the 3 DC public golf facilities. And that's because they've agreed to do it in the short term so that none of them close. Even though the weather isn't great here right now, it's obviously wintertime, and there aren't a whole lot of people playing every day. It's still community facilities. They still have driving ranges. They still have the mini golf stuff. They still have people who want to play when the weather's nice enough for their tolerance to play golf. Those facilities deserve to remain open. At least that's the view of the National Links Trust. So that's what they're going to do. The Trump administration has not announced, nor have they identified publicly, a management firm that would take over the management day to day, whether that's someone like Troon, which helped National Links Trust in this process of management, whether that's hiring Troon directly, whether that's hiring another firm, whether that's bringing that entirely within the National Park Service, whether that's hiring the Trump Golf Wing to run it and have a contract with them to run these courses, which is a distinct possibility, of course. We also don't know what the fate of all of this work is going to be. We know that the work at Rock Creek Park has stopped. It's done. It's not going to continue unless the Trump administration then somehow contracts with Gil Hansen, his firm, to continue the work and do that. We know that Trump's particular interest is with East Potomac and particularly the Blue Course. Will he and the Department of the Interior work with the National Park Service and potentially National Links Trust to allow the other work to go on and eventually come to fruition, seeing improvements at Langston, seeing those full improvements come to fruition at Rock Creek Park? I don't know. And I don't think really anyone involved knows. It doesn't seem to have been an obvious plan for the day after, day +1 of the termination of the agreement. This is going to take time. We're going to have to see what happens. But the hope here is that somehow DC Public Golf doesn't dissolve entirely, but further, it doesn't dissolve into different states of unkemptness. So whatever's happening at Rock Creek Park, that gets resolved somehow. Whether that's paused and beautified to whatever they can make of it, that's one thing, but that's a facility. Obviously, people are counting on results happening. Langston is largely unaffected, operationally speaking, continues day to day to operate as an 18-hole facility, and really weren't shovels in the ground there doing any significant projects to change that golf course at this time. So that one kind of continues to operate. But it doesn't seem like the Trump administration is particularly concerned about that golf course or that facility. What happens to the red and white courses at East Potomac? What happens to the driving range there? All of those things are very much unknown, and it doesn't seem like there's a clear plan about what will happen next. If the Trump administration decides to go forward and bringing in Fazio or a similar architect and completely renovating or redoing instead of restoring the blue course, that's going to take a long time. And that could take several years, and it's going to cost a lot of money. What Trump's vision is of great golf is more from a private perspective, right? Operating private facilities with larger budgets, requiring their members to pay a lot of money in dues every month and required minimums and probably different fees that come along their way when capital projects come up. Right, you have those things that are already kind of built in. The members are effectively going to pay for a lot of that stuff. You don't have that with DC Public Golf. You have less of a budget, and your green fees are how you get your money in the door other than your facility stuff through driving ranges and similar. Well, East Potomac's green fees are not that much, $50, $60. I mean, it's not a lot of money. And that was the intent of the National Links Trust, was to keep green fees down and lower. If Trump reimagines the blue course, would he stick to the same philosophy, or would he ultimately try to raise green fees more like $100, $150, $200 on that blue course to get the public to come in and play and experience it more like a premium public course or a resort style public course than a genuine muni that has been there for a century? Don't know, but you could probably make your interpretations based on Trump's history as a golf course owner, his eye for golf course architecture, what that prism looks like, and what he has stated, which is really to do something within government to change the blue course. With all that said, it's an unfortunate situation. The National Links Trust, I thought, did a great job in operating these facilities for more than 5 years. They're still operating them, of course, but what they did was nothing short of a miracle. To have locally based guys like Mike McCartan get involved in this project, lobby hard for several years to get the job, make capital improvements in the facilities, get 3 big name golf course architects to work pro bono on a long-term schedule to improve these facilities and stick to a mission of trying to keep public golf affordable in the nation's capital. That was great. And I hope that that somehow sticks around in some way, whether that's now or at some point in the distant future, it comes back. It was a valuable, commendable project. I really enjoyed supporting the National Links Trust because I played the event in 2024. I've played East Potomac multiple times the last few years, even though I'm right near my own public golf course and a private club and all of that stuff. But I wanted to make sure that supporting DC public golf was really important to me, and I wanted to be a part of that. I grew up closer to Baltimore. I played a now 9-hole golf course, then 12-hole golf course called Carroll Park. I played pitch and putts that were available at driving ranges. I grew up a middle-class golfer, and I still very much feel like a middle-class golfer. And to have the accessibility for families, kids, don't have to pay through the nose. Golf is expensive enough as it is to get golf equipment and to get golf balls and all that stuff. To have some kind of reduced cost availability to a quality facility can go a long way for a lot of golfers of all different ages. And I hope that continues in some fashion moving forward. I don't know if there will be legal action here. I don't know if there's a suit to be offered. I don't know what's going to happen there. I guess we'll find that out from the National Links Trust in due course. Also, apparently we'll find out what the Trump administration intends to do to manage these courses and facilities and how they'll do that moving forward. We'll continue to update you on the show as the story changes significantly. I think it's an important topic. I think it's worth talking about, and it's relevant to anyone who's ever played a public golf course owned by a municipality or a city, or in this case, well, the country. So thank you so much for spending some time with me. I appreciate it. Happy to answer any questions you might have about this particular situation. Some I may not be able to answer. Some I may be able to answer, but happy to have the conversation with you. You can get to me in the comments, or you can follow me on social media at Ryan Ballengee or Ryan Ballengee Golf, or you can email me, ryan@thegolfnewsnet.com. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you next time on the 19th Hole Golf Show.